$32 million, which seems tiny in today's resourcing terms, but it was breathtakingly big at the time. And that's where we went to see Bob Hawke with it.
And how hostile were relations between farmers and conservationists back then? I mean,
well,
was it a big achievement?
Hostile enough that when it was announced, and Rick and I were paraded out by Peter Cook, who was the Minister for Resources at the time, for the big press conference, the media just packed into the room to see if we were going to fight. And we were both quite wary of each other at that time as well. So yeah, it was a tentative relationship at first, but I learnt very quickly to admire Rick, and we became very, very close friends, and that helped really propel the development of these ideas along. And of course, Jane Elix at ACF and Phillip Allison at the NFF worked with Andrew on the development of the document. And without the three of them, we couldn't have actually articulated as we did. But let me tell you what happened when we went to see Hawke, because it was really interesting. The Labor Party really wanted to find a way of reaching into the bush. You know, it was seen as a trade union, city-based party, and it was like a golden gift to Hawke. There's never been a Prime Minister who understood opportunism better than Bob Hawke. And he saw this as being a ready way for Labor to be able to stamp its brand on the countryside. And so he accepted it on the spot. It was a single meeting, and said, "This is terrific." And when we left, Rick said to me, "Damn, we should have asked for 100 million. A billion, wasn't it?
Well, Andrew, why was Landcare needed back in the 90s? Paint us a picture. There's some fresh, new little faces here, not like us oldies.
Well, actually, Pip, I think there's a lot of people here who could equally claim credit. I'm delighted to be among so many pioneers and living legends in the room. Landcare was really adding a social dimension, and there are lots of issues that are bigger than any one property, than any one farm, and that the whole community needs to tackle. But I think it came along at just the right time where you had hobby farmers moving into some areas, and it created a bridge between lifestyle people and conventional farmers. It explicitly went out with work in the schools and gave a bridge for young people to be concerned about the management of their land in the long term. And I think Landcare created a vehicle for many women to actually step up, and had always been in leadership roles in communities, but more in the background. And Landcare suddenly was a very legitimate pathway for many women to show real leadership in their communities. And obviously that symbolic bridge between farmers and greenies. But it was really about partnership at a much broader level, and creating that social capital that enabled some difficult issues to be dealt with. But yes, there were school buses unable to get to schools because of sand drifts across the road, and there were major weed and feral animal problems that clearly couldn't be tackled by individuals just working on their own.
But environmentally back then, is it fair to say that environmental degradation was becoming, like it was on the 7 p.m. news, it was a big issue, the algal bloom that went on and on. It was actually starting to be debated. Farmers' ability to run their own properties was starting to be debated in the public, wasn't it?
Yeah, there were some pressing issues, but I think we were ready for something that was more explicitly social than just technical solutions at a paddock scale. It really was about looking at whole catchments and thinking much longer term.
And Christine, did you feel at the time that you were involved in something that was revolutionary? It was creating a whole new model for how to tackle these issues?
Yes, I think so. Peter and I came back to the family farm in 82, and we actually had a background in natural resources management, but more at the policy level, if you like. So we knew that it was an issue, but when we actually got onto the farm, and as in February 83, when half the soil in Victoria blew over our farm and down to Melbourne, then the rains that followed it a month later that washed away the creek, we realised that we had a problem, and that we weren't really farming sustainably, and that planting couple of trees here and there for decoration wasn't going to help. We had to really do something major to do to it. So that's how we first got involved. My background's been in water, but I actually came from water into the catchment management industry, and so those two streams of my life came together, if you like, in the catchment management framework. And when the decadal landcare came along, we all had to develop regional landcare plans. They were, for those of you who have been agonising over catchment strategies in the last few years, the regional landcare plans were really nice. They were about this thick, but they laid out where we thought we should go as a region. And that developed that whole catchment management approach. And I think what I've found out too, as the years have gone past, there's so many other people. You were talking about the awareness of the environment. Farmers were becoming aware of it, but there were lots of other people in the community too. The friends groups, people that are worried, the coast groups, and I promised Andy Gray I'd put in a plug for Coast Care, because there are lots of people thinking that there was going to, they needed to do something about it. We're living down at Anglesey now, but those people there in Angier have been working for a long, long time protecting the environment.
And when it started, did you think it could possibly last 25 years?
I think, I welcome the start because, as Andrew's saying, it's a social movement, and we really have, it's the collaboration, cooperation, learning, developing capacity sort of things that were really important, and they don't happen overnight. So I guess I was hoping that whole collaborative approach would last, for a long time. But Landcare, we had Landcare the movement, Landcare the program, and I think really importantly, Landcare the ethic, which everyone here.
For me, it's really about the social infrastructure, and I would hope it'd be just as permanent as any other sort of infrastructure that we build. And Australia's got all the elements of the world's best natural resource management framework, with grassroots land care, regional bodies at a regional level, the ability to target assets at a national level. The trouble is we've brought in these successive approaches and each one has undermined the previous one instead of seeing them as complementary. And so we've just seen the latest iteration with that of cutting landcare funds to fund a green army. And I don't see why we can't actually build on what's done before instead of undermining. We tend to take one.
Well, Phillip, Toyne, do you think the Green Army, does that make sense?
No, it doesn't. You don't defund 1.5 million people and fund 15,000 people. It just doesn't make sense to me. All of the drive behind the change that has been Landcare for the last 25 years has come from people who know their own areas, who do their own work, who need some resources and some assistance, but who want to pick up the task themselves. And you don't substitute that activity with a very small group of learners.
I don't even think it works, Pip, on a practical level. It might work where we are down on the coast now because you've got a whole pool of unemployed young people only sort of half an hour's drive away that can come and help us weed the dunes and do things like that. But it doesn't work when you're, 30 kilometres away from Ararat and the bus load of people has probably got to come from Ballarat, which is a 2-hour drive. You're not going to accommodate them on farm or anything. So we've been through it twice before. We've had this same model and it doesn't work.
I didn't want to derail things, Pip. And I must say I worked closely with Tony Abbott on the first Green Corps program, and I've got nothing whatsoever against the idea of giving young people hands-on environmental experience. It's just not a replacement for Landcare.
But can I half finished the story about that initial interest in Landcare. I've told you about ACF and why the Greens wanted to get into a rural setting and see if they could create a sustainability there. But the NFF had a different agenda in a sense. It saw the condition of agricultural lands in some stress, some deterioration, and there were lots and lots of reports about dryland salinity and overgrazing in the arid lands and so on. But they felt that the city voters had a very poor understanding and little empathy for farmers. They were seen to be always on the take, always wanting drought relief, always wanting this and that. And Rick, for his opportunistic part in the whole thing, realised that if Landcare could be given a sustainability flavour and purpose, then that would attract the support of city voters, and that's exactly what happened.
And in fact, LAL, Landcare Australia Limited, was invented in the Qantas lounge of Launceston Airport. Remember one day a plane was delayed on that task force and Rick was saying there's got to be some way of getting urban people to be able to, or corporates to be able to donate and put money in. And so we conceived the idea of Landcare Australia as a way of getting corporate and urban engagement to support rural activity, and literally it was because of a delayed plane that LAL was invented.
But can I tell you another Tasmanian story then, because there was a lot of confusion about who was doing what in those early days, and the Peter Cook show and tell tour of Australia involved us going to the Midlands in Tasmania, and we're out in the middle of a windy paddock. I was wearing my tweed jacket and my moleskins, which I wore most of the time, and Rick turned up in a suit. And we hopped off this bus surrounded by farmers, and one farmer sidled up to me and he said, "Listen, Rick, do you reckon we can really trust these greenies?" And I said, "I find them completely lovely people." And I wonder to this day if you ever found out the difference between them.
Well, Andrew, you were the very first National Landcare facilitator. What was it like for the first couple of years as you travelled around the country spreading the word about this whole new concept?
Oh, it was fantastic, Pip. I think I did 200 tours of Australia in 4 years and tried to visit as many of the emerging Landcare groups as possible. Initially, my role was to report back direct to the Minister and to Phillip and to Rick, which is not a role the bureaucracy was entirely comfortable with, it must be said. And whenever John Kerrin came to Melbourne, he'd come to the offices here, and I would ride my bike down from Melbourne Uni, and he'd ask for a briefing. Often it was Kerrin and Button wanting to know what was going on out in the bush, and it was a fantastic experience. But the enthusiasm of people out on the ground, I remember, I'm in the Northern Territory now, but I remember lobbying into Darwin, and the then Conservation Commission gave me a Toyota, and they said, "Drop it off in Alice Springs when you're finished with it." And I went down through the VRD and then the top of the Tanami and in along the Western McDonald's. Took about a month and visited every station and so on the way. It was the most fantastic experience. And people could get the rationale of coming together across property boundaries to tackle common problems, sharing information, making better use of the bureaucracy. At the time, most states were just starting the process of getting out of agricultural extension or on-farm free advice, and paradoxically, the Landcare program probably made that a bit easier for people, because many state government people then got Landcare funding, and it should be recognised that at the time when people like Horry Poussard and others were designing programs here at a state government level, the National Soil Conservation Program for the whole country was $1 million a year. And we put up a $340 million program. So it was a very bold thing, and it certainly challenged the traditional preeminence of the states in this whole natural resource management area. And at the time we didn't think we should be displacing state activity, but I'm afraid to say that has happened in part.
Well, if I could turn to you, Phillip, what would you say are the major achievements during that first decade of Landcare?
Oh, the people we see here. There's absolutely no question in my mind that we had no expectation when we went to Hawke that we would end up with, 6,000 Landcare groups. I think the target in the first year was 300 or something, wasn't it?
Yeah, something like
It was something very, very modest, and that was well exceeded in the first year. And it's just gone on and on and on. And so you have to say that this social network, this body of knowledge, this capacity to work is the real success of Landcare. And of course, there isn't an end point to Landcare. It's a continuous journey, and it'll reinvent itself over and over again as it evolves through time.
Not just in Australia, but 25 or so countries now have adopted Landcare. And it's been a wonderful...
It's been a great export, hasn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Are there any projects in particular or any moments that you had, Phillip, in that first 10 years where you got off a bus or out of a car and looked at what a group had done and went, this is what it's all about?
Oh, well, look, there are more than I could possibly list to you, because in the early years I was on the National Landcare Committee, and we did lots of trips to the bush. I certainly remember looking at a lot of the salinity problems down in the Coonawarra area, and people were doing very innovative things there. We went to Lake Eyre, and they were looking at entirely different ways of cropping at the time. There are too many to mention. There was a grazier just out of Alice Springs who, quite contrary to the usual management, was taking his stock off incredibly early and selling them much before all of his neighbours were going to market. And he'd found a niche way of protecting his property and also making a good quid from it. And I loved seeing those examples of just plain ingenuity, and it was often done with very, very homemade equipment, anti-scouring devices that were welded up in the shed and put out to use. It just displays the plethora of Australian ingenuity and hard work, really. So it's inspiring to do it and to see it and to be part of it.
And Christine, what do you think the major successes have been? Are they about what's happened on farm? Is it about what's happened in ag, or is it a community aspect? What would you nominate?
Well, I think, as Phillip says, there's so many different things. Building that social capital is very important, and that whole ethic of working together to manage our land sustainably has been and it's accepted nowadays that we have to do that. So I think that's probably the most important thing. But driving around the countryside, you can see where you've been. It's great to see bare hills wooded and rivers with riparian vegetation restored. We've got platypus again in our river, so they're the sorts of achievements. Yeah.
What about you, Andrew? What's the biggest achievement?
For me, it's definitely the social things. I think it's actually a trap to try and measure Landcare by kilometres of fencing or whatever, because that's really the responsibility of individual landholders. The job of Landcare is at the community level, and we haven't been that good at developing the metrics for that social value add. And I think if we'd been evaluating Landcare as a social program, we'd have said it's one of the most outstanding success stories ever in Australian agriculture.
Well, so what needs to be done to ensure its future? I mean, on its 25th birthday, you've got less money going into the future, so it's a good time to be asking the question, how do you adapt? How do you make yourself an attractive organisation for... I mean, farms are generational. Will the kids follow mum and dad into Landcare? How do you make that happen?
I honestly think we need to get back to some of the schools programs that we had in the early days. I did a consultancy for the Icelandic government, and I said, look, there's no way I can tell you what to do in Iceland. I'll just tell you what we've done in Australia. But they literally got the Victorian Landcare in schools book and translated it and rolled it out into their schools. And I was back there recently for their centenary of soil conservation. And I said, how's it going? And they said, it's fantastic. And I said, have you changed anything? And they said, Why would we? It works. And so it was amazing to me that they were doing, 20 years later, they hadn't restructured, they hadn't reorganised, they hadn't renamed anything. They'd still had the same logo and were just rolling it out year after year, and they said it's the most magnificent thing. And we continually try and chuck the old stuff out and rebrand and reorganise, and there's just so much wasted effort in all of that. So I think we have to make the case that Australia's got all the building blocks for the best natural resource management system in the world. The total cost of Landcare in the early days I worked out was the same as one bypass on the Hume Freeway. What we were talking about now we could do for way less than the cost of one submarine or whatever. So it's about national priorities, and I think Landcare's actually got to roll up its sleeves and make a bigger noise politically, to be honest.
Do you agree with that, Phillip?
Yeah, I agree with Andrew. I think that's the obvious truth. The great thing about the decade of Landcare was that it was a decade. Both sides of politics supported it and endorsed it. So the farmers setting out on their particular endeavours at the start of the decade knew that at the end of the decade they'd still have resources to go on. And I think that's enormously important, and it's missing today. And one of the things that I think that we really need to think about, though, I mean, there are opportunities in all of this, reshaping of things. We do have climate change. We do have major contributions that can be made by agriculture in sequestering carbon. I think the carbon farming initiative is potentially the key that can unlock massive resources to Landcare. And I would encourage you all to track very, very closely the issue of soil carbon and the methodologies used to calculate it, the methodologies used to replant and revegetate. And I think that you're going to find commercial drivers through those carbon sales helping with the work that was traditionally funded through government. And the only thing I'd say is that would be so much easier if the government had not undermined the carbon price, and so much easier if they hadn't created confusion around carbon trading.
But also, I think we should be making it very, very clear that we really value bipartisanship, and that leaders who are prepared to be bipartisan and long-term will be rewarded for it. Bruce Lloyd was I think, visionary in supporting John Kerrin and Peter Cook at the time. Joan Kerner and Heather Mitchell's partnership was incredibly important. Rick and Phillip's was too, and that sort of leadership that straddles the normal boundaries, I think, is far more powerful than narrow stuff, and we should be trying to demand that of our leaders. But I agree with Phillip. The more we can harness the forces of the market, the better.
Yes.
So what you're saying is, if at this time when you're looking at into the future, don't go and acknowledge what works, keep that, don't fiddle too much. I'm curious about how do you attract, and maybe Christine, this one for you, how do you attract the next generation of landcarers as some of the older ones will be bowing out?
Moving on, yes.
Yeah.
And I think, or especially in Victoria, it's probably a bit different in other states, but in Victoria, the farms are getting bigger and bigger, so that in the social aspect is sort of almost getting a bit less important, but the caring for the country and managing our land sustainably is getting much more important. So I totally agree, very, very supportive of Andrew's. Farmers need to be paid for the ecosystem services they provide, whether it be biodiversity, carbon sequestration, salinity mitigation,
Fire management,
whatever they do, they need to be paid for it in a robust system. You're not just shelving out and looks like you're doing a good thing. It's got the methodologies, as Phillip was saying, have to be very sound. So there's opportunities there. So in Victoria, you might attract the bigger farms with that sort of, they can actually earn some money off the land. Most farms have got a bit of land that probably is, with climate change, is going to become marginal. And we certainly have at home. We've got with accredited 30 hectares carbon farm on our place, because we could, under previous scheme, we could earn more money from that than we could from running sheep on it. And so it's a really good opportunity for land that's going to be marginal with climate change.
And Phillip, do you think with what's happened with the carbon tax that farmers are a bit confused about what opportunities are out there in this carbon economy? Because the carbon economy hasn't disappeared, has it?
No, and unquestionably, getting rid of the carbon tax undermined some of the certainty around price. But the other thing that getting rid of the carbon trading mechanism is the thing that has really created difficulties. And so, for instance, I'm working with Aboriginal people on Savannah, Burnie and Cape York, but we're trading with a Swiss trading company into Europe. We're bypassing the Australian system.
And we've just had Caltex have signed a deal with Fish River Station in the north since the carbon price was abolished. And that's a $6 million project. ConocoPhillips have a $20 million project with Walfer, and they say their bosses in Texas just love it. And so the fact that Australia's taken a step backwards for a while, I think means we've stepped out of that opportunity, but it's still a global opportunity, and certainly the big resources firms we're dealing with in Northern Australia very much feel as though they're in a world that's moving to price carbon and they have to be ahead of the curve.
So Phillip, are you saying that the money that Landcare might have lost in this column that might be going to Green Army, that if you work out what projects are out there, you can get it out of the carbon farming initiative? That there's money out there?
There's a prima facie argument for that. I don't know what the exact figures will be, but keep an eye on it, because I really believe that if you can unlock the potential of soil carbon, the uplift of carbon in soils as a way of absorbing more CO2, then the opportunities are limitless, and the potential returns could be huge. But I'm not suggesting that it's here right now, and I'm not suggesting that all of the technical issues in measuring it and calculating it have been resolved yet. But we're not far away from it.
And we have to wind up shortly, but if I could give you 1 minute each and you can talk about what the great achievements are, what you think should happen in the future, a message to the people here as they've got 2 more days of listening and talking and networking. Start with you, Andrew.
I think it's wonderful to see so many pioneers and legends in one place. So, enjoy getting your batteries charged and making old friends. And I think, but also we need to be thinking about ways of rejuvenating that. I think Landcare's got just as much to offer now as it ever did.
I mean, my 1 minute message is don't let the history of what's happened in the first 25 years be lost. You've all made major contributions to it. I think that this is the key to Landcare and its success. It's people, and well represented in this room. But don't lose sight of what was achieved and how it was done, because it's going to be enormously valuable to future generations as they continue on.
And can I ask you a question about that before we go to Christine? If you lose the volunteering ethic of Landcare, does it cease to be Landcare if government departments take it over? If you've got a Green Army here, you've got paying people here, is the volunteering the key to the success?
I wouldn't worry about the Green Army taking it over. It's just too small and too limited in its capacity. If volunteers aren't fully engaged in meeting Australia's natural resource problems, then the country's absolutely doomed. It's the volunteer force that has provided all of the energy and all of the knowledge that's made it work.
Christine, you have your minute.
My minute. No, I've just asked people today to think about the future of Landcare, how we are going to take it forward into a new world as the climate is changing and our natural resources are being challenged. So have a great conference.
And as a 21-year-old farmer is sitting there with mum and dad who are in the Landcare group, and he's umming and ahhing about, or she's umming and ahhing about, well, will I join? I could be, camp drafting on the weekend or going to a rodeo. And how do you convince the current generation just hitting the hitting the paddocks with their parents, that it's not just what mum and dad did.
I think Andrew answered that question, because it needs to start in the schools. You know, the person coming through the schools and then through their university degree really needs to actually understand that, balance that, the natural capital against the financial capital. And it is hard for farmers. I mean, Peter and I have done a lot on our place. That's because the kids had grown up and gone away. We didn't have to feed and educate children. It's very hard to make those choices, and very hard for young people to do it. And that's why there's quite a lot of grey hairs around in the Landcare movement.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew, Phillip and Christine, for being part of this discussion. And I think everyone here would join me in thanking you for your services to Landcare and today.